Okie dokie. So thanks for being here. Appreciate it. It's not very often in some discords that people will actually agree to this kind of thing, so I do not take it for granted. If you want, you're totally welcome to have other people here too. If you, I don't know, if you told somebody you're going to be doing this or whatever, I don't mind. Since we're not doing like a debate or anything, we're just having a chat. So I don't have anything against that. If you think you want someone to join in later or whatever, totally
I
fine
think
with
I'm
me.
okay.
Okay. And I think that pretty much covers it. So what we were originally speaking about that made this whole thing happen was monopolies. But before we jump into that topic in particular, I thought I would give you the floor, not for like an opening statement or anything, but if there's any clarifications you want from me, any questions you'd like to ask, or if you do want to have the opportunity to sort of like make a positive argument, then you can do that too.
Um, I just kind of want to know how you define anarcho-capitalism, because that's like what this whole thing is centered around, I
Cool.
think.
Well, I think that's totally fair. All right, so anarcho capitalism is going to be stateless, and there's going to be property rights. And that's pretty much it. So the label anarcho, some people, especially like in the communist and socialist traditions, they take that to mean no hierarchies or opposition to hierarchies. In the anarcho-capitalist sense, it just means no state, specifically no state, nothing to do with hierarchies at all. And capitalism in this context means that private property is a thing. So that would differentiate us from somebody like an anarcho-communist or other similar things where they believe in statelessness, but they also believe in not having property rights of any kind. So no such thing as ownership, or an even more abstract alternative might be that they don't believe in hierarchies at all, and they also don't believe in ownership.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like what I would define it as. Yeah.
I have a really cheap keyboard here, so try not to judge me too much for my misspellings because I got big
It's all
old fat
right.
fingers. All right, so basically, and the only other thing I think that's worth adding to that is it's all derived from the non-aggression principle. So statelessness is because the state is a violation of the non-aggression principle, and property rights is because you need property rights to be able to distinguish between aggressive and non-aggressive acts in the first place. So that's kind of just worth throwing in there because that's the ingredient that makes everything make sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so sounds like we're operating on the same definitions then. So I don't want to go on the attack. So why don't you tell me what you think about monopolies? What I don't know, whatever way you think you'd be most comfortable presenting it. Um, what do you think we get wrong about monopolies, or wherever you want to start from?
Well, I did hear from the previous chats we had that you said that monopolies only happen when the state is like involved in it, when the state causes it. And I think that's really not true, because I think I think monopolies can happen with the state because the state has a monopoly on lots of things. But at the same time, monopolies can happen without the state. Like we've seen it happen in the past where businesses can gain monopolies over things, over commodities, over goods and services without the state having anything to do with um, with giving them that monopoly, with giving them that kind of monopoly.
That is totally fair, and that does sound like something I would say. I want to qualify. Oh, God dang it. I want to qualify that statement a little bit more than what I maybe said because you're talking about like a text chat probably. So I don't know really like where I would have said that, like what the context is, but I want to elaborate on that a little bit. So um, in the free market, it is the case that monopolies can emerge. So I wouldn't say, or sorry, I wouldn't say like explicitly that monopolies only happen when the state's involved, um, unless no, I actually would make that statement as such, but my meaning is this, and I'm gonna justify, I'm using the words the way that I am because this is how Rothbard would use them. Murray Rothbard's a prominent anarcho-capitalist thinker. So there's a distinction between a monopoly that is like, so let's just agree a monopoly in the first place is just the sole supplier of something. Or sometimes they'll say it's the sole seller of something. Either way. Do we agree that that's what a monopoly is?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
when their product is like the almost always the only one you can get of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so a monopoly, like, well, let's just say they're the only supplier then. I think we're in agreement about that. So a monopoly can happen more than one way. And Rothbard makes a distinction between a aggressive monopoly and a voluntary monopoly. I don't think those are the labels he uses, but that's the distinction that he's making. So the difference is if you are just talking about a market in a general sense, and you are the only supplier of something, and there's no aggression happening in the market whatsoever. So you've got like a truly free market. The only way to be the sole supplier of something is that you are, for whatever reason, either you're the only person who has access to it no matter what. So there's some real examples of this that are really easy, like yourself. You're the only person who can offer yourself. Now, like maybe labor you can do, anyone can do. Like if you're going to do something like simple, like flipping hamburgers or whatever, I think that's sort of the staple. Um, but you are a monopolist over yourself. So if you want to be someone's friend, for example, that's an example of something where you are a monopolist. But in the market, either the person's the only person who has access to it, like it's a mineral that's so rare, he's a monopolist just automatically, or alternatively, it's because they're offering the best price, so no one can compete with them because they're already maximal in the benefit that they're providing the consumers. So if you want to spend time on that too, I can get there. But basically, like my position is that the market makes it necessarily the case that if a monopoly emerges, it's going to take that form. If the state's involved, the state does something that's called a triangular intervention. So it's a type of aggression where like a standard aggression is somebody attacks another person. It's one person on another person. A triangular has three people involved. So what's being aggressed against is actually like an exchange that's happening. And when the government does that, there's all kinds of different ways that the government can do that. So price controls, licensing, prohibitions of different things. Those are all examples of um, triangular interventions. And when that happens, something really important breaks down in the market, which is competition. Competition is a function which enforces what I was saying earlier. So it's because of competition that in a market, the emergence of a monopoly has to be the result of maximally benefiting the consumer. The simplest way I can say this is if you just assume that there's a minimum amount of cost in producing something, and that sort of determines what the price of it is, the minimum possible profitable price. And then you have this sort of, they're going to charge as much as they can more than that because the incentive for everybody, I'm sure you agree with me about this, everyone's incentive is to make as much profit as possible.
Yeah.
Because we're greedy. So whatever I'm using my hands, Jess. I just realized they're not in frame. Whatever the extra amount is that they're charging, that creates the incentive for competitors to enter the market, and that prevents the monopolist from doing that essentially because they'll start losing customers, and the incentive is proportional to the size of the exploitation. I wouldn't call it exploitation, but just to be like basic about it. So the more that they increase their price above what's the necessary minimum, the more like proportionally and potentially even exponentially they're incentivizing other people in another market. So monopolies only happen when the state is involved is not the case. Monopolies can emerge in a market, a truly free market, but in a free market, the only type of monopoly that can form is the kind that benefits the consumers. And in one of the states involved, not only is it possible for those other kinds to emerge, but it's also essentially guaranteed.
I agree with the fact that that the state does do that, the triangular intervention when there is a monopoly. Um, but I disagree when you say that only that monopolies in the free market can only benefit the consumer, because when monopolies, in a sense, that they give the provider of the good or service the ability to upscale the charge because nobody can compete with them because they have a monopoly to begin with. And they would incentivize competition if the competitors could gain access to that type of good or service and provide it. But like in a monopoly where there's like one good, like say there was like a super rare fruit that was like in like a forest, and someone owns that whole forest, some company, and they are the only one who has access to it, then they can charge however they want for it, and that doesn't necessarily benefit the consumer because they do get the good, but they have to pay whatever price the company deems is a valid price as long as it is proportional to the demand for it.
I think I understand what you're saying. So in a market economy, if there's an exchange that's taking place, the exchange has to be voluntary, right? So
Yeah.
if you are the owner of the super rare fruit, and you manage to make a sale, and let's say, I don't know, whatever the price is that's too high, but people are still buying it. So praxeology or just economics would tell us right off the bat that if people are buying it voluntarily, they must have the expectation that they're mutually benefiting from the exchange still. So how do we determine that what's happening here with this fruit is not in the benefits of the consumer?
Well, it's beneficial in that they get the product, but if they're spending a ton of money to get it, when it would be easier and better if it were sold for for a smaller price, then that in the end it harms the consumer if the if the company's charging a higher price for the thing that should be really at a lower price if it were not a monopoly and if there were fair competition.
I so if I'm understanding you correctly, and definitely correct me if I'm on the wrong track here. So you're saying it's harming the consumer because conceivably the consumer could have paid a lower opportunity cost in obtaining the fruit.
When I say harming, I don't mean like I don't mean like it's actively harming them to do the transaction, but yes, it would be a lot better if it weren't monopolized and if there were fair competition, and if there weren't a monopoly which would allow for people to be able to buy the good at lower, more reasonable prices. And in the end that does lead the consumer to have to pay more, and that is in general harmful, but not directly, because they're not directly being harmed by paying a higher price because, like you said, it's voluntary. So it's not like it's not like they're forced to buy the thing if they don't want to. But if it's like a monopoly and like something that's really important, the fruit isn't important, isn't that important. But like if there were like a medicine that someone had a monopoly over, that would start to get into the thing where like it is harming them that they have to pay a higher price for the good.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned medicine because, I'm not aware personally, and I could be wrong about this. It wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not aware of any medicines that they just whatever the material that they're made out of exists in one very very small location that only one person has access to. Um, it seems to me that medicines are something that are developed and produced like just about anything else. And the reason that's so interesting that you brought it up is that like anarcho-capitalism is not friendly to intellectual property. So one of the, if not maybe the most problematic considerations when we talk about medicine is that intellectual property allows the producers of medicine to create scarcity that wouldn't be there otherwise by preventing other firms from producing um, the medicine. So if you invent like you could insulin, I think is one that comes up all the time, but we can just talk about medication X. In anarcho-capitalism, we would not have this pretend make-believe artificial scarcity that currently exists. That is the explanation for why medicines at all are harder to get your hands on. So um, it seems like anarcho-capitalism would be the state of affairs you'd want if we're talking about medicine. Of course, I think the exception to that would be is if the medicine is made up of some material that only exists in one really specific place and only one controller has it. Now, I would still think that anarcho-capitalism is the best way to handle that. Um, Maybe I should just say why, even though I'm talking too much, but just I might forget otherwise. If you have a material that's super useful for medicine, let's say it's a flower and it only exists in one place, and I mean like a backyard here. I'm not talking like one country. What you want, I think me and you probably agree on this, is you want that to be put towards its best use, and its best use is going to be, well, hypothetically, we're assuming it's the medicine, right? Like it's better to be used as a medicine than to have the person either just use it for decoration on their property or to, mash it up and use it to make a dye for his tie dye t-shirts or something like that. So in an anarcho-capitalist system, or even just like in a free market generally, what's going to happen is the demand is going to drive up the price, and it's going to create an enormous incentive for this person to part with the flower. And it's going to create an enormous incentive for people to try to cultivate the flower elsewhere if they're able to do so. Um, Basically, in short, all the incentives are aligned to what you would probably call the pro-social outcome. So I think even in that case, you'd still see that a free market is the situation you'd want to be in.
So you're saying that like the free market guides the product to proper use through incentive.
Yeah, as long as there's an understanding that, like, conceivably, if there's only one flower in the whole world that can, I don't know, cure diabetes or something, the fact that you're living in a free market doesn't stop, like, a lightning bolt from hitting the flower and wiping it out. Or a person making a mistake and accidentally crushing it or something like that. But the free market makes the incentives such that everything is aligned towards the pro-social outcome. The gardener, you could say, well, what if that gardener, um, he just likes the flower so much he doesn't want to part with it. But the demand, like assuming, because we are assuming in this hypothetical that the flower is useful for some really important medication, the demand would obviously be so astronomical that you would have to be imagining in this hypothetical that the person with the flower prefers the flower over like boundless riches and all of the things he could obtain with the boundless riches. It is absolutely possible under a system that respects property rights that somebody could do that. I think that's true for any system. I think you could also make a similar criticism of any alternative system. But in this system uniquely, the incentives are all aligned towards the pro-social outcome in ways that they aren't in other systems.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that that yeah, the person would tend to use the plant for however the market generally wants it to be through that incentive of you make more money. But at the same time, while that is true, I do feel like it's still I guess in the end, even in like a normal system, you couldn't prevent it used from being used for the use of creating a monopoly because it's still on someone's property and property still exists in today's system. So I assume it wouldn't be a difference with anarcho-capitalism, but I do still feel like even with I don't know, I don't even know where I'm going with this. It's the same thing for anarcho-capitalism and now, where you have the property and if it's on your property, you still choose really what happens with it. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
That's true. I think so. If I could just wrap that up, then I would say, like on that topic, if you have a situation, and I really want to emphasize, this is super not like real life. We don't really have any resources that are like that. There's some resources, like some countries have aluminum and some countries have uranium and others don't. But for the most part, we're not really in any situations where one person has a flower that saves millions of lives or whatever. That's not that kind of far fetched. But in any case, whatever the scale is of the monopoly, I think my claim is you want to be in a free market. A free market is what incentivizes the monopolist to do the most pro-social thing. Now, this is indicated by the profits that they make emerging from voluntary transactions. Voluntary transactions are implying that all of these people that are giving him money, they're saying in the act of giving the money, especially if it's a lot of money, that they're significantly better off because of it. Because, like, for example, um, if you give somebody, you go to the dollar store and you buy something for $1. Well, the thing was more important to you than $1 was. You know, probably that doesn't mean very much. But if you're spending, if you're voluntarily spending thousands of dollars on something, then you're saying, what I'm getting for this is so important to me, it's so valuable to me that look at all these things I'm willing to give up that I valued in order to have this one thing. And yeah, I think that's why you'd want to be, if there's a situation where such a monopoly is possible, the free market's the situation you'd want to be in.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. That in that situation you would want a freer market. Yeah.
Sweet. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so let's take a step back then, and I'll ask you a question this way. I get the impression still that you've got some hesitations about the free market still, and it doesn't have to be about monopoly, but we can stay in that domain if that's easier. But what is the intuition you're having right now? What's the hesitation you're still feeling that's saying, okay, well, it makes sense in these situations, but I still wouldn't want to be somebody who advocates for the free market. What do you like? Where do you think that intuition's leading you or coming from?
Well, I feel like if there's no state and if there's no state that intervenes in the economy whenever things do go bad, then that leaves the economy in a bad place. And we kind of saw that in the past with like the Panic of 1907, when like the market did its thing where someone tried to corner the market and it didn't work out and everybody got distrustful. And even though the government didn't intervene then because it didn't have the means to do so, it did inspire the creation for the US to do so with the creation of the Federal Reserve. And I do advocate for a generally free market, but I also advocate for a safety net for when the economy does go bad, when things do get out of hand, then the state can intervene to resolve that. I don't advocate for the state to just needlessly intervene whenever there aren't things going wrong. But I feel like if there is no state and if the state can't intervene, then the only people who can really intervene are the people with the money. And in anarcho-capitalism, the only people who would be able to do that would be the people with the most money. And I don't necessarily trust them to do the right thing. I would rather. I also don't trust the state too much, but I trust the state more to be able to do that over just people with money.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good answer. There's a couple things to get through there. I'm going to try. So I'm not a historian, and I'm going to have to just be somewhat topical about this or superficial. Regarding the panic you mentioned, my understanding is that the depressions that took place and the economic crises, let's say, where the government intervened very little, were the shortest and the least severe. And all of the depressions, especially the Great Depression, where the government did intervene a lot, were astronomically more severe and far longer. I think we're talking about a difference between like a weeks or a few months in the cases where the government doesn't interfere, and several years of absolute calamity when they do. That's my current understanding of the relationship there. But like I said, I'm not a historian, so I don't know that it would be appropriate for us to get into that. I might just be uh, doing too much speculating if we did. The next thing you mentioned was, I think I wrote it down there. If there's no state, the economy is vulnerable, and I'm curious about in what sense, because if you have a sort of distrust, let's say, for the wealthy, and I think that that's sometimes justified. And I want to be clear about anarcho-capitalism. Maybe this is a good point to introduce this. Like anarcho-capitalism is not pro big business. We're advocating for competition, which is the dearest enemy of big business. So anarcho-capitalism is for a competitive state of affairs, which is what every big business hates. Every big business wants to try and destroy competition so that they can preserve their profit and their market share while doing less work. And the anarcho capitalists are going to argue that the ways that they can do that, the only way they can do that, is through exploiting government intervention, which is why there's so much lobbying. Right? Lobbying is trying to purchase the selective application of the government's power. So lobbying wouldn't make sense if it weren't for the government making that possibility in the first place. Um, I'm trying to remember all the points that you mentioned there, and it might be a good idea to just talk about what was already said. Um, but I think that, yeah, I'll leave it here. If you were to, so you were observing that the rich have a lot of influence over the state of affairs. So there's some sort of crisis, and you're saying you don't want to turn to the rich because you distrust them, but you're less distrustful of the government. But how does a rich person, especially like at the percentile that you were talking about, where they have the ability to save us from crises or to diminish them in some way, where did their wealth come from? So their wealth has to have come from a proportional pro-social work that they did to make society a more prosperous place. And it's not prosperous in. Oh, sorry. Did you want to disagree with me
No,
there?
no, you
You
can
can
keep
jump in.
going.
Oh, I would say it's not only that they get, they don't just decide what more prosperous means in their own mind and then project that out. A person can only become wealthy by satisfying what the consumers explicitly want. It's the demands of society where the wealth comes from. Now, on the other hand, the alternative there is the government. So let's say you've got an autocrat who is going to have the authority to put some sort of response to the crisis in motion. Well, what did they do? They're a politician. So all of the profit that they're being given is coming from harming people. It's stolen in the form of taxation. It's nationalized industries. Nationalized industries aren't industries that the government starts. They're things that the government takes away from people who actually were originally entrepreneurs. So then, what is this person who is the autocrat? What are they? What are the tools on their chessboard that they're dealing with? Well, in the case of the businessman, they're having to put exclusively their own property on the line. So they only get to do what they think is actually going to be effective. Whereas the politician is using things that he doesn't really own in a sense, but they're not his either. So he doesn't, how should I say this? Like uh to I'm trying the reason I'm struggling with this is I'm trying to avoid using specific historical examples because I find that they tend to be like unnecessarily, you go down a rabbit hole. But I'll give in here. Like a politician can order soldiers to go to war because it's not his life on the line. He can order factories to produce weapons instead of whatever they were producing before because it's not his profits and loss on the line. And if the enemy bomber planes have to destroy those factories for the war effort, it's not his factory that's at risk. So that's not true for the rich people. It's their property that they have to risk. Um, I guess what I'm trying to say, I'll wrap this up here so I don't accidentally ramble for too long. What I'm trying to say here is that it seems to me that the politicians are the extraordinarily worse people to have making those decisions because politicians are going to be incentivized to create crises and in their application of solutions have all of the wrong incentives because they're dealing with not their property, their tools or other people's property, whereas the incentives of the wealthy is to do the opposite.
So to answer what you said at the start, before the question you asked, when you talked about the historical examples of how the panics were shorter and more less government intervention and were shorter because of that, I would like to point out that the Great Depression, it was over a decade long, but for the first 4 years of it, from 1929 to 1933, Herbert Hoover didn't really do anything. He just kind of advocated for the private businesses and for the wealthy people to intervene themselves and avoided federal intervention. That's why he lost the election. FDR got elected in 1933, so he did still take multiple years to resolve it, but it was also a different scale because the panics were more short-lived. They're more short-lived. A liquidity crisis is centered in New York, but the Great Depression was a global economic crisis, so that's why it would also naturally take longer to resolve. On top of the first few years of it just gradually getting worse because nobody really did anything to resolve it. Um, as for your question, if the rich have influence, but I trust the state more, where the the rich people's wealth came from. While a lot of rich people did work for their wealth, a lot of people also inherited it. Like Donald Trump, for example, he is. A lot of people say that he was a millionaire by the age of 8, and when you're 8, you can't really do meaningful social work because you're just 8 years old. So it's not really. While it is true that a lot of people did get their wealth by working, there's also a factor of inheritance to take in. A lot of people There are people who really haven't worked that much and still get well off because of inheritance, because of family connections, because of work already laid out before they were old enough or born to be able to do that. Um, at the same time, though, when you did talk about the politicians, they don't have really like the decisions that they make are less on the line because they don't involve them as much. I did think that's interesting, and I do agree with that because it is true that politicians have less on the line when they're making decisions about about businesses, factories, wars, stuff like that. That is true, and that is for the reason that I generally don't trust them too much with that type of thing. But really, the reason that I prefer politicians and government to make those type of decisions is because those people are, in the end, elected in most cases. So, like in a democracy, the people who can convince the most people that they're right for the job, right to do that type of stuff, are elected, and it's still not a guarantee that they will do the thing correctly. It's still not a guarantee that they'll do the right thing. But I think you can't really decide who gets rich as much. You can't really decide like whether a billionaire is going to become a billionaire or not. Politicians, there's still a lot of things you can't decide about what they do, but you go off of what they promise, and I think you're putting more trust in the politicians because you're voting them in because you have a choice of who's in power than you have more than you have a decision on whether rich people are going to make a lot of money. I still don't trust politicians too much with that type of thing. That's why I advocate for more of a laid back social net, so that when things get bad, then the state gets involved. Um, but generally, they should be more hands off, I think.
All right, thank you. So, like I said before, I'm not a big expert on history. I'd love to take more time to read it when I get the chance. I just want to say that there's a book. I have read this book. I just don't have the mastery over it to maybe make an argument from the book directly. So, what I'm going to do is say Murray Rothbard has a book called America's Great Depression. And in that book, he argues. And one thing I want to say about Austrian economist authors is that they are very good at leaving all the receipts. There's tons of um, footnotes about this. Rothbard makes the case in that book that, as a matter of fact, the government was very involved the whole time and leading up to it. So not just, like I think you said, it was for 4 years they didn't do anything. So he would argue against that in that book. And like I said, I can't make that argument, so I'll say there's my source, and we'll move on. On the topic of inheritance, something I think you might find really interesting is that statistically speaking, and I don't have the statistic right in front of me, but statistically, generational wealth usually only lasts. You got the person who accumulates it, and then the next generation, like 80% of them lose it, and then like hardly it ever gets to a third. Um, what does the market do with people? So you use the example of Donald Trump. Here's a guy who inherited money. Well, the first thing is, if you are, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or something like that, and you earn all this money by genuinely helping people, it doesn't have to be helping them like digging wells in their yard. Mutually beneficial transactions. Um, Elon Musk can go and buy a sports car if he wants, or an expensive house, or he can go on vacation, or he can give gifts to people. And giving gifts to your children is one of the things that's a valid thing to do with the money. Um, but of course, to be an inheritor doesn't necessarily make you competent. So there's going to be people out there who have money to spend, but didn't earn the money through their own personal. Even though the money still corresponds to a real good that was done out there, the person who's now in possession of the money is not the person who did it. So they're not competent. They might not even be good. Well, what is the system that I would suggest deals with that the best? I would say that the market economy. The reason that the market economy is the best for dealing with that is because what does it do? The market economy isn't just about profits. I think that's a common misunderstanding. I'm not saying you have this misunderstanding. The market economy is not profit focused. It's profit and loss in equal parts. The loss is taking resources away from people who are bad with them, people who spend them in frivolous ways, people who are making bad investments in like a business sense, like they're building things that people don't want to buy. They lose their resources, and people who are very interested in their own consumer activities are also losing their resources. They have a lot less resources than they would have otherwise because they're spending a lot on fast food or fancy cars or vacations or whatever have you. Not that there's anything intrinsically wrong with those, of course, but that is a way that the market is correcting, who has what. So the inheritance problem, I think, is an interesting one. I think it doesn't represent a real problem because of the way that as soon as children inherit wealth, yes, they're very lucky that they get to live their lives with a silver spoon, but they don't become some kind of block of unearned economic actors who are neither competent nor good. They have every possibility of being competent or good, but statistically speaking, they almost always just squander it. And that money isn't destroyed, it just goes back out into the economy. So if you buy a car, it helps the car industry, what have you. So I think I'll probably just leave it there on the topic of inheritance. I just don't think like all of our big players today, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk come to mind. I don't believe that I don't believe that their current wealth is explained by inherited wealth. So I guess I'll leave it there for the inheritance. On the other thing you mentioned about politicians being elected, it's a really interesting one. I guess I'll push back in this way first. Most people that I talk to, and this is just purely anecdotal, I'm not like that's not supposed to be evidence for anything, but most people I speak to, just right out of the gate, they agree with me that elections are like a terrible way um, of finding the right person for the job. So, there's historical sentiments like bread and circuses. Like, what do you do to be a successful politician? Well, you make people promises that things you're going to do with other people's money. You do a lot of lying and scheming, all things that have nothing to do with production and have nothing to do with um, making people better off. It's just it's like politician. The activity is almost entirely based on deception, and well, we'll just leave it there on deception. Um, and then what do? Their entire incentive structure. If you're a producer, your incentive is I want to make money. I have to produce things that other people want. If you're a politician, the incentive is I need to use this 4 years that I'm in office. I mean, I think if we're Canadian and American, so 4 years is pretty standard for us. 4 years, you get in, and you have that amount of time to just use up as much as you can, make as many promises as you can, help as many people as possible, hope that you're going to be able to get your family into, um, you know, advantageous positions on boards of directors and other postings. And that's what the incentive is. Now, I think that that's sort of self-evidently true that that's what the incentive is. Um, so yeah, I guess I would want to hear more about why you think that an election at that sort of scale is an appropriate means of finding a qualified person, especially when you're comparing it against the people whose influence is proportional to their actual productive contributions.
Well, I agree that that elections, like, there's no perfect way to select someone who's good for the job, and elections aren't a perfect way to do that, because we've often elected people who have done the opposite of what they're going to say, and people who have done not so great things. And in general, when I do advocate for elections, I advocate for them to be more decentralized. So, like, I think that that elections should be more on the local scale, and that communities should probably have more power than they already do. Um, and when you say that, like, you can't remove people who are elected because they have the 4 years, the 8 years if they get another term, that's true. Um, because the only people who can, in the U.S., the only people who can remove the president are congressmen, and congressmen can't be recalled
Hold on, I don't
or
want to.
anything.
I don't want to interrupt, but I think I gave you the wrong impression there. So I wasn't trying to draw attention to the fact that they can't be removed. I was drawing attention to the fact that they have a finite relationship with the control that they can exert. So a producer wants to make his stuff last as long as possible because that's the way that he maximizes his profit over his lifespan. A politician has the inverted incentive. You come into, like, if the politicians were coming over control of a single factory and they have 4 years, their incentive is to use everything as quickly as possible towards their own goals, because in 4 years time it's going to be someone else who comes into the control of the factory and they're no longer going to be able to extract any benefit from it. So that's what I was drawing attention to. Not I was not trying to make a case about how easy it is to remove somebody from office or not.
Yeah, okay. And yeah, I do agree that that politicians, they don't, the only incentive that they have to do the things they do is through the power that they have, while people who work in the market, their incentive is they make money, they build their lifestyle on it. Politicians have less to lose in that matter. So I do agree with that. And still, though, I feel like when you have elections, it still gives the people more power to choose who has the better position of power. With rich, I guess, in a way, with rich people, you still do, in the end, the market still motivates and drives who does end up with more money. But in the end, with elections, you give the direct yes or no to the person. You choose who will be elected. You don't really choose their policies, because in the end they can just do something that's completely different. But in the end, I feel like it's better to be given in the hands of the people through a direct yes or no, rather than through a system where you don't directly give a yes or no, but you choose whether you take that product or good from someone, and you choose whether to participate in that transaction or not. I feel like saying, like, a yes or no in the election sense is better than to give a rich person power through sort of like less supportive, less direct approval ways.
Okay, I think I understand the concern you're expressing there. Cut me off if I end up going in the wrong direction here. I think that you brought up a really interesting example. I mean, Trump is such a prominent part of the news cycle right now. Let's talk about Trump for a second. Trump was definitely. I've heard the story that he started off with a small loan of $1 million. I think that's the pop culture phrase. Somebody gave him, his dad or something gave him $1 million to start investing with. So, what does Trump have the freedom to do on the free market before he gets involved with politics? What can he do with his money? Well, he can spend it. Oh, wait, that's it. So, basically, what Trump has the ability to do with his money is to either squander it. Now, you could argue that some of his profits came from fraud, like failed businesses and stuff like that. And nothing could be, well, few things are a bigger problem in the criminal justice of ANCAP. So fraud is very much dealt with in ANCAP. So if somebody like Trump was obtaining his profits through fraud, that would be something that ANCAP not only could deal with, but there'd be a very strong incentive to deal with it. But I don't want to go down the wrong route here. My point is, the free market is the condition where Donald Trump has one thing he can do with his money. He can spend it, and if his expenses are consumer in nature, he's enjoying, sports cars and stuff like that, but at the cost of he's losing his wealth, and the actual producers are coming into control of it. They're getting the profits. Or he can do bad business and just lose the money, but the exact same thing's happening. He's losing his market share in the economy, let's say, and all the people. So if he builds a building that ends up being derelict, the construction company still profits for doing their honest work, and all the other corollaries, the electricians and what have you. Or alternatively, he can grow his wealth by benefiting other people. So if Donald Trump uses his $1 million to produce a business that people actually wish to patronize, then he gets more money, and the amount of money he gets through that is proportional to the benefit that he's creating for other people. So it's really interesting because that's an example of, I think, something you brought up as a negative, which is this inheritance. Now, I've argued already that inheritance constitutes a very narrow band of society, but also here's an example of how the market deals with this. Donald Trump. So what happens? What changes about the situation that makes Donald Trump no longer a harmless? What's the word I want to look? Spender. He's out there spending his money doing what he wants. Well, it's politicians. It's the political game. Now Donald Trump has the ability to affect other people's lives in ways that are not voluntary. And there's sort of this. I think there's sort of this cruel irony for you, where the idea was that we can't trust the rich people, but with the electoral process, we get a little bit more accountability. But Donald Trump, who you mentioned as being a case of somebody who inherited their wealth rather than earning it, Donald Trump is who got elected. So I think I want to point out that is an irony I think you should pay close attention to, because that's exactly what I would want to draw anyone's attention to is, wow, we really should rethink this election thing. Now, you mentioned decentralization, and that's a really fun word for me. But before I get there, what are we electing? We're comparing who should be in control, the person who's elected by the people or the rich people. But that's not actually what we're comparing. Because at no point does the anarcho-capitalist, at no point do I say, okay, Jeff Bezos, I mean, he's just so wealthy, he must be a master at benefiting the people, so he should be in control. That's not what I'm saying. There is no mechanism or institution in anarcho-capitalism by which people have power over other people. There's just nothing like that. And any violation of that principle makes somebody an outlaw, which means that everybody else in society can just take what they want from them, basically. I'm super oversimplifying that. All my ANCAP friends are going to watch that and be like, what did you just say? But I want to give you the impression of how making yourself an aggressor is very much not in your best interest if you're a citizen in an ANCAP society. So we're not actually choosing between, should it just be somebody who's rich because he makes fancy cars, or is this guy who is popular with all the people? Because in the election, you empower this person to have control over other people's lives and properties. The rich people aren't getting that. So I want to really emphasize here, we're not choosing between the popular person and the rich person for control. We're choosing between people having influence over their own property only, and how much property they accumulate is the consequence of how well they help other people with their property by creating things other people want. Or we all choose somebody who now has power over everybody else in a non-voluntary way. I think that's the true comparison. I do have stuff to say about decentralization, but I don't think it's fair for me to talk for so long without handing the floor back.
So I do agree when you said that, like, when we choose when we choose a politician, they can do like they can go they have power over people. And you said that anarcho-capitalism, there is no institution for people to have power over another person. But while there is no institution, money, when you have more money over someone, in our current system, but even more so in a system where there is less regulation, you do have more power over another person when you have money, because with that money you have more access to resources, and you have more access to the means to to influence someone, even non-voluntarily. Like, for example, like if someone owns a hospital and it's like one of the only hospitals in the area, you kind of have to use that hospital, or you don't use a hospital at all, and that can be bad. And when you have more money, you do ultimately have more power over another person. There is no institution, because there are really no institutions in anarcho-capitalism, if I understand correctly, because there's no state to have the institutions. But
there's no state-like institutions. You'd still
yeah,
have institutions if you mean it in like a broad sense.
yeah. But when you have money, you automatically have more power over another person if you choose to use that money. Obviously, if you sit on the money and you don't use it, then you won't have more power over another person. But it's the idea that when you do have more money, you do have the potential to have more power, and 9 out of 10 times people will exert that power because they can. And why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they really exert that power?
Well, I think it's really important to make sure that we don't conflate two different types of power here. So, in an ANCAP society, and for anybody who thinks that I'm like ANCAP is such a like it's just a ideologically loaded term. What I'm saying is in a group of people who are all participating in the simple norm of not aggressing on each other. That's all we're talking about. So in a set of people who are not aggressing. Obviously, what we're talking about is not having the ability to aggress against each other. So in an ANCAP society, there's never this power in the sense of being able to force other people to do stuff. Because as soon as you've introduced that, you're aggressing on somebody. Like if you live in your house, but I'm so rich that I can hire a bunch of people to surround your house with army tanks. And then I'm saying, well, I'm going to blow your house up if you don't come to my birthday party. Well, that's super, super, extremely not kosher with ANCAP. The kind of power you're talking about is the kind of power that comes from having things, but it's a very different type of thing. So if I say, um, you know, if I say, Tuba, I will come to your birthday party on the condition that you will come to mine, I'm influencing you because I have control over my birthday party and I want you to let me go to yours. So I have power over you and I can exert this by saying I'm only going to let you come to my birthday party if I can go to yours. Now that is the type of power you're talking about in terms of function, because it's the exact same thing if I say, I own the only hospital in town, and I'm not going to let you get your insulin medication anymore if you don't let me go to your birthday party. Obviously, that's a very severe reaction to take, but that's just this functionally it's the same thing. But it is functionally extremely different from doing aggression. The whole purpose of aggression is you're acting on someone else's property that someone else owns. Um, so I think that's worth noticing. I believe we're going to go, if we continue down this topic, I believe we're going to go in the direction of the Coconut Island analogy, if you're familiar with that, or just in general, the communist idea that you have to work to eat and therefore wages are slavery. I think that's the direction we're going in. Before we do that, can I just ask, um, and you can just say no comment if you want, but like I want to know your thoughts on, and this isn't a got you. I'm being very genuine here. You mentioned Donald Trump as an example of why inheritance is bad, but he's the current president of the United States. So how do you sort of like? Do you see that there is a problem there, or do you think there's a reason why that doesn't count, or I just want your thoughts on that before we move on.
Well, in regards to him, I don't think it's a problem for someone to inherit someone else's wealth, because that's their right as a parent to pass their money on to their child after when they're done. I really only used his example in the context of not all rich people do work for their money. He did work somewhat, but obviously some people get a much bigger head start than other people, and it's not necessarily a problem to have an inheritance, because that's the right of the family, of the parents, to pass it down. But it was just in that example of whether rich people do work for their money or not. I do think that most of them do, because like you said, the 80% thing, or like 80% of the recipients of generational wealth kind of lose it. Um, but yeah, that's what I meant when I said that. And um, you said how functionally, like, it's the same with the birthday party analogy and the hospital thing, where you said that it's the same thing where, like, you say, like, I'm not going to let you use this service if you don't do this, and it's the same thing as that. But my argument is that I feel like the state social safety net that I was talking about, it should guarantee the right to use a lot of those services, because a lot of things, a lot of arguments and disagreements over the type of thing where, like, you can't do this if you don't do this, those can be kind of unreasonable, and those can have real life implications. And I do think that in most situations they won't, but when, like, the birthday party, that's not a real life implication, that doesn't really matter, it's just a party. But like with the hospital thing, like, it would be bad if someone suddenly got cut off for their access to insulin or something like that, like you used the example of. And I strongly support a social net to ensure that the right for certain goods and services, like healthcare, like food, like water, is guaranteed, is like the basic guarantees. The very immediate needs, I think, should be guaranteed. And that's kind of the only reason why I do advocate against that aspect of ANCAP so much, because, as even though the state does do a lot of things wrong, even though the state does infringe on their people and their rights often, those are the very important things that I do support being guaranteed in a society. And there may be other ways to guarantee it without necessarily being a state, but I feel like that's the most present and easiest way to guarantee the very basic needs that someone needs to be able to survive.
Really interesting. Really interesting. So let me run through a hypothetical right quick. Let's say you've got a village, and I'm bringing up a village because you mentioned like a little population that only has one hospital in it. So I'm trying to meet you there. So let's imagine a similar type of community. Do you imagine that if somebody who's in that community was just super rude to everybody, let's say that they're a racist, and they're just like completely incorrigible in every way, they're just terrible, they're just a bad person, you can imagine in that case that people are going to stop voluntarily transacting with them, right? So like the owner of a bar might be like, dude, you just bring everyone down when you're here, just stay out of here. And then the baker might be like, hey, you said like some really mean things to me, I'm not selling you any bread. And you can imagine, I'm sure, that such a person would eventually have to leave their community because they've alienated themselves from everybody in the community. Is that conceivable?
Yeah, I think it would make sense that if someone were being negative to people, if someone were being like a nuisance, then yeah, the community would start to reject them. Yeah.
Do you think that that's like for the community to do that sort of thing? Do you think that that's justifiable? Like each individual person just slowly, it's like, hey, I'm just not associating with this guy anymore.
I think it's
Even if,
justified.
even
You
sorry, I
keep
just want to say,
going.
like, even if it puts him in a situation where he has to move out of that community just to survive because no one will sell him anything anymore.
I think it's justifiable to an extent. I think that, for most goods and services that aren't life essential, I think it is understandable. I think it's understandable people would feel that way. I think it's understandable people would revoke his access to many services. But like, if he's like, if, for example, the one hospital, if he were being mean to everybody in the hospital, like, kind of close their doors on him and kind of wouldn't treat him because, he's negative, he's not being a good influence on society. I do think in the instance where like he needs medical care and they won't give it to him, I think that isn't justified, because I feel like even if someone is being negative, even if someone is being a burden on society, they should still get those very basic goods and services that they need in order to survive. And that's why I also advocate for prisoners. Like prisoners, they do bad stuff. They do things that are illegal, that result in negatives on society, and that's I still advocate for them to have, livable conditions. Obviously they're in a jail cell, but like they should still get food, water, um anything needed to keep them alive. And I think the same for the town. Obviously, like, you wouldn't give him like candy if he's being bad. That's understandable. You don't give him candy, but like when you said like the baker, like you like a piece of bread, any simple food, if he's hungry, he should get it, because because I feel that it should be a given right for that person to have the things that they need to keep them alive and to keep them sustained.
I think that's a totally reasonable thing to be worried about. I do want to draw attention to the fact that that sort of implies that the baker doesn't own his own stuff, because you're saying if he doesn't, if the meanest person in the town is just super abusive to the baker all the time, the baker is never able to just be like, dude, I just don't want to do business with you. Otherwise, it's justified for armed people to come in and force him under threat to give the bread over to the guy. But actually, that isn't the direction I was going in. My point is, I wanted to say that it is conceivable to you that there's this behavior that would lead people to not want to associate with somebody anymore, even though they would benefit, right? So the baker saying, "Hey, man, I'm just not going to patronize your business anymore. Like, I don't want to sell you this bread," even though the baker would get bread for going through with the transaction. Now, there's all kinds of behavior that's just, I think you and me would agree, the common man, the common citizen of Canada or whatever country is going to find like, so walking around town insulting people, yelling at all hours of the night, stuff like that. These are things that we can all agree we just don't like. How disagreeable do you think it is to be the owner of a hospital and refuse life-saving medication to somebody who would have paid otherwise, because they won't invite you to their birthday party? Do you think that would not also have an exponentially bigger, uh, same type but larger reaction, where people be like, dude, I'm not going to that hospital anymore? Because if it did, then right off the bat, you're saying, here's a community where there's like a ton of demand for medical services, which means that there's profit possibility there, for somebody who to just, all they have to do is start doing any number and quality of medical services, just without being the person who randomly excludes people from life-saving medication.
Well, I mean, for him to not to be refused service by the hospital or refuse hospitals in the area, you would probably have to have done something really bad, like probably like vandalize things, probably like injured someone, maybe attacked someone in the hospital or worse. So I it would make sense that they would not want to treat him. I do think it would make sense for them to not want to treat them, but I feel like in the end, you would kind of you would have to give him the service, because otherwise you're causing harm to him by refusing to give him the service that he needs, not directly, because you're not directly injuring him or making his situation worse, but like if he's injured and you're refusing to help, that's like kind of that is in the end worsening his situation. And that's why I think that even though he probably had to do something really bad to get rejected by the hospital, because the hospital could be making money off of that, like it should still be a right for anyone to get any sort of treatment, any sort of good or service that they need keep them alive. And when you talk about how the baker wouldn't own his bakery completely if if people would be able to go into the bakery and order him to do a certain thing, that is true that he wouldn't own it entirely. But at the same time, I think that even if he doesn't own it entirely, it should still, I think it's more beneficial for the entire community as a whole, even if in that case the person is that the person that the food would go to it was being a burden on society. I think in the end it still benefits the society more to have a system where people who have a certain thing are made to use that certain good or service to benefit the people by giving it as a right for people to have and to not be able to deny service to people just on that basis if it harms them and if it prevents them from having their right to live.
I hear you, and I want to meet you at being concerned about making sure that as many people have the things they need to survive as possible. I want to draw attention to one thing really quickly, which is that what I was trying to say with my example about the hospital director obtaining the ire of the community was that you're actually in this conversation demonstrating something. And you're demonstrating that you would find it very objectionable if the director of a hospital was arbitrary in excluding people from access to the services of the hospital. I think that's uncontrovertible because you're presenting him doing that as an example of something that's very bad. So let me just ask explicitly: if you became aware that any business owner, whether it was a hospital or a baker or anything, if you became aware of the fact that they were refusing service, like if the baker was refusing service to African Americans just because of their race, or if the hospital director was refusing access to life saving medication because of birthday party invitations, would you shop somewhere else?
If there were another option, then yeah. If there were like another hospital in the area, I would go to that hospital. If there were another bakery in the area, I would go to that other area. Yeah. It depends on whether there is the ability to be able to get the the critical need from another place. Obviously, I wouldn't want to go to that place even if there were no other option to do so. But if there's no other place to get food from, if there's no other hospital to get life saving care, then I wouldn't exactly have an option.
Right. It is absolutely necessary. Well, but maybe not. So something that economics talks about a lot is that we don't really choose between like the same alternate versions of the same thing. So if you can't find an apple to buy, you might buy an orange. And if you can't find any fruits at all, you might settle for popcorn. And if there's no food at all, then maybe you'll rent a movie instead. This is the like basic function of how alternatives work. So perhaps it's true that there's no other bakers, but would you like? I want to know from you if there was only one baker in town and he was just absolutely nasty, would not patronize black people at all. Would you buy his bread because it's the only place for you to get bread? Like you personally?
If
I'll
I would,
I want to be fair, so I'll just say I wouldn't.
yeah, I would try not to get the bread. I would do everything I could to not do business with that person as much as I possibly could. Yeah,
Right. So if you had a real hankering for bread, would you go without bread, or do you be like,
I would
man?
go with that bread.
Right. Me too. Me too. So we're on the same page there. So what I'm really trying to say with this whole domain of the conversation that we're in right now is that here's an example of how people coordinating, and when I say I shouldn't even use the word coordinating at this point, people acting in their own self interest with uh, the simple rule that they don't initiate conflict, which is what we mean when we say aggression. So just people looking after their own interests and not committing aggression solves these problems essentially. You're saying that if anyone were to do something, and I assume, and tell me if I'm right about this, that denying somebody insulin is way worse to you than being a racist, even though being a racist is really bad.
Well, yes, that would be really bad to be a racist, yes. But it would be, I think, worse to deprive someone of the thing that they need to live more. Obviously, like you could be a racist and do the same thing, but like if you're just discriminating if you're just discriminating but still providing the life required thing, but contrary to not discriminating but just not providing the thing that you need to live. I think it's worse to not provide the thing that someone needs to live over just discriminating.
Right. It's really bad to do that, especially
Yeah.
over an arbitrary reason. So we are in full agreement there. So what I'm building here is here's a way that we can that this situation solves itself, because in order to, like you said, you are less offended by the racism, even though we agree that racism is really bad, but you would just totally go without bread. Now, here's a situation that's like much worse than bread. Now, what I have to do at this point is attack the hypothetical a little bit, because hospitals are very diverse in the services that they offer. And so you might have a brain surgeon one floor above a general practitioner and a place where they do hearing tests, and that's one floor above where you just get over the counter drugs at a pharmacy, right? So the idea that there would be a community where there's absolutely nothing that they can do for an alternative to a hospital is really hard to think would ever apply in real life. Because if you need insulin, and you have the ability to get it, the only reason you can't get it is because the person at the hospital won't give it to you for no reason at all, or no good reason. Then it's kind of like, okay, well, why can't you just get someone else to get it for you? Is he going to just have to screen every single person to make sure that they're not secretly sending the insulin to you? And if he is, let's just say that he has the ability to do that. What if, and again, like it's only the government that makes it so you have to get a prescription for this stuff. If without the government, there'd be no reason for the hospital to be like, no, I'm not selling you insulin. You don't have a prescription. But let's say that that's how it works. Then why can't you just go to another town? And if you keep doing this like tortured hypothetical, well, no one will help you get the insulin. The doctor has perfect knowledge about who's trying to help you. You can't travel to another town and even if somebody was willing to drive you, all the bridges are out. Then eventually what you get to is a situation where somebody had such a tiny reserve of insulin that at any point, if somebody says, I'm not selling you your next dose of insulin, they're just going to die. And I would definitely say, I will be on record as saying, if you are dependent on a substance to live and you just arbitrarily don't have enough of, like, you're going paycheck to paycheck with it, essentially, I would say that is a bad move unless you literally have no other way of getting out of it. But I would say that's not a situation that would come about in the free market. There's no limitations on that sort of thing in the free market. So I think that's kind of an example of how do I want to put a bow on this? This hypothetical problem where we're saying we need the state to solve this problem. Well, it's not really a realistic problem in the first place. And all of the ways that we can find that it is realistic, like needing a prescription for a drug, those are things that only come from the state in the first place. So I would say that this hypothetical doesn't succeed at presenting a reason why we should feel that the state is justified at being involved here. Like I said at the beginning, hospitals do all these different services. So if it came out that, oh, hey, everybody knows old Bill, who's the town friendly guy, and the director of the hospital killed him because he just cut him off his insulin because he wouldn't invite him to his party. It's a huge ask to think that nobody else is going to be able to source pharmaceuticals for the pharmacy to operate, that the general practitioners who work there aren't going to be like, dude, I'm not going to work at this hospital. I can literally just work out of my home. I'm a GP. That's how they used to do it. GPs used to just work out of their home. So the doctors don't have to be there. The only thing that you're going to need is, well, okay, but you need to have a really fancy hospital to do brain surgery. But of course you do. But how many people in the community? We have the community is simultaneously so small it only has one hospital. It can't be having that many people who need brain surgery. So you get that really rare case. I mean, most communities probably have nobody in them who has ever had brain surgery. If it does come up, then they're going to have to travel. I think that's true in any case. So I think that for those reasons, this hypothetical fails to justify the necessity of the state. What do you think about that?
Well, I do think that it is definitely a very rare circumstance for you to not be able to travel, not be able to get any access to any medication because, there's pharmacies, there's hospitals. But like in a place like in rural Texas, for example, um, 4 million people there live in pharmacy deserts, which are areas where you have to drive over 10 miles to get to a pharmacy, and those pharmacies are often understaffed, struggle to survive. And obviously, they would be struggling more if they were doing things like refusing to give medication to certain people just based off like arbitrary things or even important things. They would be struggling more. Um, But even so, even if like it's a rare circumstance to have in most parts of the world, um, I still think it is really important for there to be some sort of guarantee. It doesn't even have to be from the state, but there should be some sort of guarantee where someone has to give another person like food, water, health care if they are able to provide it. I think that's really important to ensure the functioning of society, to ensure that people have the very basics that they need to survive, and only really the very basics. I think that a lot of things beyond that should not be mandatorily provided, but things that give people life, things that give people a fair chance in the world, like education. I think those types of things should be mandated by some sort of mechanism, something that can guarantee them, even if a lot of people won't ever have to use those mechanisms. They should just be there as a safety net for the very few unlucky people who would have to depend on that safety net.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I really think, truly, not speaking hyperbolically here at all, I genuinely believe that this is maybe one of the biggest hurdles that people have with their political ideologies. And what is it? What is this thing I'm talking about? It's the concern or fear. Some people, it's a fear. They're terrified of this. And for other people, it's a concern. It's some sort of like a humanitarian interest in other people. But it's this issue of I'm worried about people falling through the cracks. And I think everything that you just said is perfectly encapsulated by that sentence. You're worried about people who fall through the cracks. So it doesn't matter how unlikely the hypothetical gets with the bridges being out and there's only one hospital for whatever reason. No matter how unlikely we get it, we just what I'm hearing from you is that there's just zero tolerance for a situation where people fall through the cracks. Now, here's what I would really like. The number one impression I'd like to leave you with is that first of all, there is absolutely positively no way to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks. Every government on earth that's currently, every state that has a government has, I don't even want to say a number because it would seem like I was exaggerating, a huge amount of people who are falling through the cracks all the time. I suppose that the answer to that is, well, maybe we just have to keep fine tuning what the government's doing. Eventually, the government can do things enough that nobody falls through the cracks, right? Now, I'm going to pick out something silly here, but I'm going to assert that it's true for all of the possible issues. So let's say that the government wants to make sure that nobody slips and hits their head on the pavement anymore. So this argument would apply to anything: car accidents, overdosing on drugs, doesn't matter. Government's decided, hey, no more people are falling through the cracks, slipping and falling their heads, slipping and falling and hitting their heads, right? So, well, they issue helmets to everybody, but some people choose not to wear them and they still slip. Okay, well, now the helmets are mandatory. You have to wear the helmets. Well, some people, despite the punishments, still don't wear their helmets. They still slip and they get hurt. Okay, well, in order to account for this, we have to start hiring people to actually watch for people not wearing their helmets. And still, some people are hurting their heads. Very small number now. Now, at this point, I want to say before I move on with this hypothetical, enormous amounts of resources that could have been put to better uses have all been wasted. So everybody in society is way poorer because of this. But the problem continues. We can't let anyone slip through the cracks. So we have to tear up all the concrete and replace it with soft padding. Concrete sidewalks, concrete stairs. But it turns out that concrete's not the only hard thing. It's wood too. So we got to get rid of wood. Now, why am I saying this? Well, it's that is what happens when we don't want to let anyone slip through the cracks. Let's take something more realistic now. Let's talk about car accidents, right? So we don't want to have anybody getting in a car accident at all. So if we were going to take that, we don't want anyone to slip through the cracks. What's that going to look like? Well, seat belts are mandatory, and airbags are mandatory. What about helmets? What about speed limits? What about maybe we should make it so cars can only go so fast, and they all have to have these big, wide bumpers around them. There's an unlimited amount of extra costs that we can do that's just going to be chasing this. We'll make sure nobody slips through the cracks. And I don't want to torture you with this, but you could easily see the same thing with drug overdoses or infanticide. So serious things, not so serious things, but the logic is serious. So there's just, we have to make sure people don't slip through the cracks. What I'm going to say next is, what can we do to make sure, if we accept that it's impossible to stop people from because for example, let's say the slipping and hitting your head thing, we could conceivably stop that from happening. We could get that number to 0 if we attached everybody to a board, and then the board was like completely impossible to fall, and it had like a chain on the roof, and the chain would just move you from room to room, and you'd be like a painting, and the painting would move from room to room on this chain, and now that way it's impossible to fall. So it's possible to get to 0. Obviously, we don't want to do that. It's impossible to have 0 car accidents, but we don't want to do the things that take us there either. So since we know that it's impossible to have a situation where nobody falls through the cracks, what is the way that we can make the fewest people fall through the cracks, and the people who do fall through the cracks fall and have the least consequences, let's say? I would argue that that's the free market. Why is it the free market? Because in the free market, you have, well, I'm going to just say a bunch of things. You can call me on any of them if you think I'm lying here. An enormous increase to the amount of money that people have to spend, a extraordinary decrease in the cost and scarcity of all the goods on the market. Those would be the two main things. And one important incentive to remember is that the people with the least amount of money in society are the people who actually have a lot of money to spend. Not individually, but the poorer strata are the majority. So if you're really concerned with the majority in a sort of majoritarian sense, a lot of people who are interested in democracy talk about the primacy of the majority. If you're a business person, you are going to be way more incentivized to sell to the poor people than to in most cases to the rich people. Obviously, the poor people are not buying Lamborghinis, but most people aren't selling Lamborghinis either. So, to me, and I'll let you talk for as long as you want after this, it seems to me that it's impossible and completely in error to try to bring about a situation where no one falls through the cracks. And the free market is the absolute best way to ensure that the fewest people are going to fall through the cracks, because there will be far less poverty in general. And when the case does occur that people fall through the cracks, it'll be the least severe, because there will be far less scarcity for things like medical treatment and stuff like that. I got actual examples to give about this, but before I continue talking, I want to give it back to you.
I agree when you say that there's no way to stop people from falling through the cracks entirely. That number will never be 0 as long as there are people alive. That's just something you can't do. But at the same time, I also agree that generally a freer market and one that's less regulated allows people to bounce back better in some instances. I won't say all, but I also won't fight that too much because that would take another hour off of our debate. Um, but at the same time, when you say that, the free market is the best way to go about that, I kind of agree. I agree that there are parts of free market, there are aspects to it that do make it easier for people to bounce back, for people to have as little consequence or impact that happens to them when they do fall through the cracks. But at the same time, I generally prefer to have as much of a safety net, knowing that it won't stop that from happening, knowing that it won't stop it from happening entirely. I prefer to make it as difficult as possible for it to happen. Now, when I say as difficult as possible, I don't mean like, obviously, I don't, when you're like falling and slipping on concrete, I don't want to go to the absolute extreme to prevent that from happening, because there obviously is and should be a limit to what you will do and how much of it you will do to prevent it from happening. There's obviously a limit when it just becomes too far-fetched, when it becomes a thing where it's not actually making a meaningful difference. But that being said, I feel like it's just better in the end to have a simple thing as like, okay, you can't you can't block someone from having access to this critical thing that they need to survive. You can't prevent someone from getting the medical treatment they need to survive. I think that type of thing, that's a very low cost thing, because it doesn't cost the government money or resources to really do other than to enforce. To enforce it, yes, you do have to pay people to enforce it, but it doesn't cost money to really come up with it. Unlike with your board example, like when you said like you could attach everybody to a board to prevent them from falling down. Like, yeah, that would cost a lot more money. That would cost a lot of resources and really wouldn't, it would just not be worth it in the long run. But I think in the end, guaranteeing access to the very basics so people don't have to worry about them, even though most people won't ever really rationally have to worry about them, is, I think it's very important for people to be able to have that guarantee and to know that they won't have to worry about that.
So, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was something called lodge practice. Have you ever heard of it?
No, I have not.
So, this falls into the topic of mutual aid. What used to happen is there were these fraternal societies, and today we still have a few of them, like the Freemasons are a fraternal society. Um, Around where I am, we have like the Rotary Club and stuff like that. The fraternal societies had all kinds of organizing reasons for being. So some of them were based on a certain philosophy that they all had in common. Some of them were based on their racial or religious groups. So you could imagine that there's a fraternal society for African Americans who live in Philadelphia, or for Jewish immigrants from Poland who live in the Bronx. Those kinds of things. There was an enormous amount of fraternities, and you could also have them just based on the neighborhood. In any event, what used to happen for these fraternal societies and just community organizations in general is that they would hire doctors so that their membership would have access to these doctors. And they would be like on retainer. So they would just be they would have a guaranteed income as long as they looked after the members of the lodge. But they could also, a lot of the time as well, they could even practice more on the side. So these were very, very desirable contracts. And well, obviously, because you'd have like a guaranteed income, which lots of doctors liked. And then you'd also have the option of continuing to practice in on the side. So what's really interesting about this is that during the time that lodge practice was actually allowed. Now, where am I getting this information from? I'm getting this from a book called Mutual Aid by David Beto. and he's got all the receipts in there. It's a super interesting book, very dry because it's just like it's all just statistics and sources and stuff like that. But it's a very good book. At the time that lodge practice was common, I believe that it was over 98% of all of the United States had coverage. They had medical coverage. And the cost of getting this coverage for your entire household, if you were a member of a lodge, you could get an entire year of unrestricted access to the general practitioner of your lodge for $2. Even when you account for inflation and you adjust that to today's money, that is a pittance for what you're getting. Now, why did this stop? Well, before I get into that, one other thing I think is worth noting is that during this time was also the case that medical services being provided as a charity, so getting access to medical care for free, was the highest it has ever been in history. It's never come anywhere close ever since. I'm quoting the book from that. I don't remember the specific percentage, but that's the claim. It's never been rivaled since. Why did this practice stop? The foundation of the American Medical Association, the actual, you can look this up if you don't believe me. The reason that the American Medical Association was formed was because some doctors felt that they weren't making enough money. Why were they not making enough money? Because doctors liked the lodge contracts so much that they would compete with each other, and they'd actually bid down the price of their medical services. So doctors competing with each other for the lodge practice contract would drive their prices way down. Some doctors felt that this was, I'm quoting here, I believe they said that it was, I can't quote it because I can't remember the exact words, but it was something like it was dishonorable for their profession that they were making less money than they thought was appropriate. So the American Medical Association was formed to petition the government to intervene in this situation by making lodge practice against the law and by limiting the amount of doctors who were able to enter the market by choking supply. So they did this by making it so that you required a license to practice medical services, which wasn't the case prior to this. And they made it so that universities, only select universities could give those licenses, and only a finite amount. So like a university that had permission to give doctors licenses might only be able to give 5, for example. Now, this obviously made lodge practice illegal. It made the prices of medical services skyrocket, and the availability of doctors plummeted. This was exactly what the American Medical Association said they wanted to do. They wanted to increase their profits as doctors by choking the supply and getting rid of their competitors who were participating in the lodge practice. Americans, and that's just, I'm saying I'm Canadian, but I'm talking about Americans because that's what the book is primarily about. Americans never recovered in terms of the quality of medical care. They never recovered in terms of the cost of medical care. They never recovered in terms of the availability of medical care. So this is, I would say, an astronomical crime that has cost, I would speculate, tens of thousands, much more likely hundreds of thousands because of the amount of time that's passed, lives to be lost due to lack of medical care. And the entire story is about how, without the government being involved at all, human society had already succeeded at making sure the fewest number of people were falling through the cracks. And because, like I mentioned earlier, medical services were being offered for free very, very commonly. So for those who even did fall through the cracks, it was very much the case that they could rely on charity from either their neighbors or from the doctors themselves. I guess I should leave it there because this is an example of how the desire to resolve this internal tension of just really, really strongly wanting there to be a safety net has brought about advocacy for policies that have the exact opposite effect. They have devastated the human well-being. And when I say human I want to say human well-being here, not just in the sense of our access to cheap goods, but our actual quality of life and access to medical care as well. And again, that's all of the statistics there are coming from David Beto's research that he published under the name Mutual Aid.
I agree that charity is a good thing for people to turn to when they need a necessity. As in your example for the doctors, yeah, people needed to have good quality health care, and they basically formed the system on their own without the government, and they did their thing with it. And I agree that it can work in some scenarios, but in other areas where there's charity or where there's volunteer um, assistance and work, it can go a little bit differently. Like in New York City, for example, in the 1800s, the early 1800s, it was all volunteer firefighting. There wasn't a standardized firefighting like agency kind of thing. I don't know how to say it. Department, yes. Um, and the kind of thing that happened was that there was a lot of ineffective and disorganization that came with it, because there was a lot of infighting between the volunteer firefighters. There were only about 300 volunteer firefighters, and they were all starting to fight each other because of they were part of different political networks. They're part of different
Why would
street
they
gangs.
be? Why would they be volunteers?
Well, they would be volunteers in order. Well, there are two reasons why they would be volunteers. They would be volunteers simply to be. When I say volunteer company, I don't necessarily mean like they were volunteers because they were companies. So they were. There was obviously a paid aspect. I think I could be wrong, but generally, you would be a volunteer if you were simply trying to do something out of your goodwill. If you were not getting paid and you were just trying to do something out of your goodwill, you would be a volunteer. And in the case of New York City, I guess they were volunteer companies. So they were either full volunteers or they were kind of just like different firefighting companies. But either way, they were fighting each other. They were having disputes, and that was causing problems. And that eventually forced the city to essentially adopt a better model, a full department that's also had difficulties in some dimensions. I won't deny that, but it's better than to have different competing things for something so essential. I do think competition is good in the economy, but when it's not for something essential, when it's not for something like for something that people depend on, because competition can fail and can collapse and can cause negatives. Competition can also cause good things with essential services, like healthcare competition can increase the quality of healthcare, because if you have better quality healthcare and if it's cheaper, then people will use that service better. But in other instances, when it's like a life or death situation, it can also have negative impacts. And that's why with the doctors thing, yes, there was charity. Um, they formulated that, they came up with it all on their own. And with that, they made their thing work. They made their situation work without the government. They had their own social safety net that they formed on their own. But um, in some instances, it can work, and it can be a very beneficial thing, charity. But in other instances, it can fail, and that's why I think generally charity is good, but people be dependent on shouldn't be dependent on the charity safety net either. I think a government safety net is more effective than a charity net, essentially, because even though they can both be positive and they can both be negative, I think the promise of a government is, although it can be broken, it's more institutionalized, it's more sturdier, in my opinion, than a charity net, because even though both can fail, as a government that's servicing entire areas, you kind of dependent on charities spontaneously appearing, but the state is just kind of there. The state is there, and it can be unreliable, but at least foreseeably it's going to be a general constant, unless ever abolished.
Okay, well, on the topic of charity, let's just really quickly clarify that I was my whole spiel there about mutual aid was not actually emphasizing the charity. The charity is just the cherry on top, the charity on top. Uh, what I was emphasizing there was that 98% of the people, before we even get into charity, healthcare coverage was at 98%. If I'm wrong on that number, it's definitely not no lower than 95. So it's somewhere north of that. I'm pretty sure it's 98% coverage. It was also extraordinarily affordable. So many people were not paying for it at all because it was covered through some sort of collective contract, and the people who were paying for it were paying $2 per year for their entire family to be covered, and it was an extra 50 cents to $1.50 in order to have all your surgeries covered as well. So that's like surgeries in the broad sense, it's brain surgery, tonsillitis, whatever. So just even if you just assume there's no charity going on there, the comparison is still extraordinarily in the favor of mutual aid. Now, there's we're still, and I think that you might agree with me about this, but what I'm still hearing is there's just this the concern about people falling through the cracks is just too strong to leave it up in the air. So let's look at the modern case. We're both in Canada, I assume, because we met in a Canadian
I
Discord.
live in the U.S., not Canada, but yes, they're
Okay.
similar.
Well, then my American examples were justified then, I guess. But so I'm in Canada. Are you aware of the statistics that came out from the government themselves that, well, there's this multiple statistics contribute to the claim I'm about to make, but in the United Kingdom and in Canada, on the low end, on the low end, there are tens of thousands of deaths per year that come about as the result of the government's mishandling of medical care.
Yes,
Okay,
I'm
so
aware of that.
how do we reconcile this sort of concern with, well, I want there to be a government in order to ensure that there are no people falling through the cracks, but the government not only is like there's people who are just still falling through the cracks, so the problem isn't even solved, but now we've got tens of thousands or potentially hundreds of thousands of people dying a year due to the fact that the government is not letting this be resolved like it was before and has stepped in and taken control over it.
Well, when you say people are still falling through the cracks, yes, but to have a guaranteed source of health care, that automatically gives you that safety net of, you know, that you're going to get access to health care no
No,
matter what.
no,
Well, kind of.
no, because if so, when I'm saying, like, specifically what's killing all of these people is that they're on waiting lists. So this scarcity of medical services is a creation of the government. It didn't exist prior to their intervention in the services. So if you say, well, nobody can fall, like I'm paraphrasing here, and you're welcome to correct me if you feel that my paraphrasing is uncharitable, but I think I'm saying this correctly. Essentially, you're saying nobody can fall through the cracks when healthcare is free because healthcare is free. You can just go to the hospital whenever you want. Or if you can't get to the hospital, you can call an ambulance. If you go to the hospital and die waiting for a doctor because the government is so bad at providing medical care that they can't handle the volume, then saying that it's free does not establish that you actually have access to it. You are free to go to the hospital and die in the waiting room. And even though that sounds dramatic, like I said before, the government will tell you themselves that they're losing tens of thousands of people per year to that exact scenario. So we have to be really clear about the fact that, like, to simply say that it's costless in a monetary sense does not mean that we've ensured nobody found. In fact, what's happening right now is the number of, like, the cracks are widening and the pit is deepening.
Well, I agree that that people will still fall through the cracks even if they have guaranteed, even if it's free, even if they are, you know, um, able to get health care because it's free, even though, you know, that doesn't factor in the wait times, as you said. And when I say something like, when I say guaranteed access to healthcare, I don't mean like the government opening up a hospital and you all line up and you go to the hospital when you need to. I don't mean that when I say, um, when I say access to healthcare, I mean like you cannot deny someone healthcare like at all whatsoever, even if you own the hospital. That's the kind of thing I mean when I say access to healthcare. Because you're right that having like having healthcare be free does not guarantee access because there's the wait times, there's mismanagement, there's scarcity of hospitals, obviously. So free does not mean free of cost does not mean free of access. But at the same time, um, like I said, when I say freedom, when I say like freedom to access healthcare, I mean like nobody can deny you healthcare, and that's the kind of thing that I want in a safety net. And like you said, the hospitals, like I wouldn't include that because I wouldn't include the government um, making hospitals. That's not really part of the freedom to access it because they're just building more hospitals that they're operating. But when I say the type of thing of like of being able to access it, I mean like you can't deny it. You know, like you can't deny having access to it, and that businesses and people shouldn't be able to do that. And I feel like the state, it may not be the only way to enforce it, but I think it is a good way to enforce. And you are right with the that people will obviously fall through the cracks. There will be instances where people die because of government mismanagement in terms of healthcare. But I think the right that I'm trying to give people, which is the right to access it, which is the right to be able to access it no matter who the owner is, no matter what they say. When I say that, I mean like I think that's the best minimalist way to ensure access to healthcare in regards to the state. There may be better ways to do it without the state, but I think that's the best way to do it in terms of whether the state guarantees the right to do that. And I think it's very minimalist. I don't think saying that okay, you can't deny this person the right to go to your hospital. I don't think that really changes anything. I don't think that kills people. I don't think that leads to the mismanagement thing that you're talking about with state-ran hospitals, state managed and operated. Um, because you're just saying like you can't deny this person healthcare. Obviously, wait times are wait times. You may not be able to. The wait times could kill people, but that's independent of whether you're giving someone the right to access the hospital. It's obviously different in terms of Britain and Canada, where they have state operated um, healthcare, where obviously, yeah, there are those wait times. That is the state directly, their negligence leading to people dying. But just in terms of like saying like, okay, you can't deny this person healthcare. That doesn't kill people, and that doesn't create wait times unless I guess there would be more people technically going to the hospital because you can't deny those people to go. So I guess there would be maybe longer wait times, but that the policy itself wouldn't lead to the type of thing that happens in Britain or Canada because the state isn't operating it. They're just saying you can't. They're just telling all the private practices you can't deny people the right to use your hospital.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, after everything you've just said, it sounds like the scope of the claim is either much smaller than I originally thought, or it's contracted considerably. It sounds like the only thing you're worried about right now is you can't deny medical care to somebody, and it has nothing to do with whether or not the free market is actually providing medical care. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is you agree with me completely that the free market is in every sense the superior provider of medical services in every sense. The only point of disagreement is that you don't want them to have the option to deny care to someone.
Honestly, yeah, I think that's it. And beyond healthcare, with food, with water, with any other necessity like education as well. Obviously, there will be private schools. I think private schools are, you can't really do much about that. I'm not really pushing the education aspect as much because that's not necessarily essential to life. But like food, water, anything you need to survive, I think, yeah, I think the free market probably is the best provider for that type of thing. And I don't think that's something I really realized until now. I was kind of that's something I did kind of realize now. But
Sure,
yeah, I think
sure.
they are the best. I think they are the best provider, and I think the only point of disagreement is whether they should be mandated by a higher body, whether it's the state or someone else, whether they can deny service for that, or whether they're made to be mandatory to provide that.
Cool. That's very cool to hear. So, am I understanding correctly that there's a sense in which you're moved like right up to the goalpost of being an ANCAP, but the thing that's stopping you from crossing this finish line is you would like to still have that caveat of not being able to deny people access to the care. So everything else, you're an ANCAP basically, at least in terms of like free market economics. You're just like that 1% left is just not being able to deny anybody access.
I think economically wise, yeah. Socially different because um, there are certain things that I think should be mandated by a higher body, whether it's the state or something else, that things that should be mandated that everyone should have to follow regardless. I think that's the only thing that I do kind of
Can
disagree
you
with the ideology on. And I hadn't realized that until really now.
can you share some of those with me? I'm interested.
Well, if I were just looking for like, the policy list of the Libertarian Party of America, one of the things that I do disagree with is, when they kind of say like no no health care like medicine requirements. And like that's kind of applies for like the vaccine mandates that we saw in COVID. And I do disagree with that because I think if there's something that everybody should get to provide um, to kind of make society better, to kind of make everyone's health better in general, I think that's kind of something that should be followed. But at the same time, it's also like a slippery slope because if someone bad got in power into the state and told everybody to take a certain supplement or do a certain thing medicine wise that was
Like
bad.
RFK.
Like what?
Like RFK?
Well, yeah, he hasn't mandated anything though, so that's kind of less
No, but
so.
he's the kind of guy you wouldn't want there.
Yeah, if he was mandating like, okay, everybody has to take this medicine even though it's bad, like yeah, that would be the type of thing that would be negative, and I would be a negative example of using that for. But like in terms of like if it were only like the COVID vaccine mandates and if there were no policy of I mean not policy, possibility of anything negative happening with that, then I would fully agree with that. But I'm kind of on the fence with that because while I do think there are some things everybody should naturally do to improve the health of themselves and the health of society, and that shouldn't really be up to discussion, at the same time, there are other things that could be used negatively with that.
So I'm glad that you brought up this example because it's still in the domain of healthcare, so it keeps us kind of on the right track. Let me ask you this question: can you produce too much healthcare?
Yeah, I think to a certain point, you could be trying to do too much to alter the body, to alter people's health. I think yeah, there are probably instances where anyone could really be producing too much healthcare.
Can you share with me a method or process that you would endorse for determining what is the optimal amount of healthcare?
I think, like for example, the World Health Organization, they've gotten things wrong in some instances, but like I'm pretty sure they're the guys who all come together to decide on like what the flu vaccine is going to look like, and those are the type of guys who kind of um the type of people who decide like what a certain health practice should look like, what procedure should be like, and I think they would be the type of people who probably would be the best because they have scientists, they have doctors on their team.
Well,
They would be
we're not talking about a technological question, right? Because I'm not asking you what is the best way to invent an effective vaccine. What I'm asking is like just assume that we've already invented the medicine, right? Uh, what I'm asking is, how do you determine, and I'm asking that in a literal sense, how do you determine, or how would you want someone else to determine the optimum amount of healthcare to produce?
Well, if it were solely up to me, and assuming that the government weren't making me do anything, then I would generally listen to scientists, to the majority of them, and see what they're saying about it. I would generally trust
How
them
do
the
you think
most.
scientists determine how much healthcare we need to produce?
Well, they study obviously the body, the mind, anything that factors in with psychology, with biology, and they kind of develop a kind of balance. Obviously, with all the different things being created nowadays, they can't always be up to date. There will obviously be things that get approved by like a body like the FDA and get shipped out, and that are negative, and then they have to recall that thing. So obviously, like in today's world, when so many new products, so many things are being produced, obviously there is no surefire way to ensure that they can stay up to date. But like generally, when they determine whether something is beneficial or not, whether there's a good balance of things, they study how the body interacts with it. They do experiments, they do test trials, they do that type of thing to see health impacts, and they determine whether something is dangerous or not. And they try to keep things as optimally healthy as possible for people, even if they're not always successful at that.
Gotcha. I think you're missing my point a little bit there, and I'll take responsibility for that. I may be asking my question poorly. So, like I said before, assume they've already invented it. So I'm a pro science guy. I'm not a science skeptic, generally speaking. So I'm with you in terms of, I'm not a biologist. Let the biologists, the medicine types deal with inventing vaccines and making them effective and stuff like that. So that's not my question. My question is, how do you determine how do you determine the correct amount of healthcare to produce? And I'm going to rephrase that now. If you're like, for example, if you're a hospital, how do you determine how many x-ray machines you need to buy?
Well, you
and
look
and, and,
at
and you can phrase it the same way. That is still the same question of, how do you know how much healthcare to produce? Healthcare is a big term, so it includes visits with doctors, it includes equipment, it includes training, includes facilities, all this sort of stuff. That's all healthcare. So x-rays, what we're going to talk about now, is the same between how many doctors do we need to hire, how many janitors do we need to hire, how big does the hospital need to be. There's an infinite amount, well, not literally, there's a very humongous amount of considerations to make. But just for the sake of keeping things straightforward, we're going to talk about x-ray machines. What process is used or could possibly be used to determine the optimum amount of x-rays?
if you're looking at how many x-rays to buy, you kind of look at how many people are generally visiting your hospital, your healthcare practice, and how many people usually use the x-ray. So like probably looking at past records or records from other hospitals if you're just starting up, and you look at like, okay, this we had 300 visits with the x-ray last year, so we should probably buy like one x-ray per 100 uses or something like that. That's a totally made up number.
Well,
But
that's what I'm kind of curious about. Like, so let's say you have a hospital and you are the director, and you find out whoever's doing your data analytics says, okay, well, we know for a fact that we get 100 people who need x-rays every month. And okay, so how do we go from there to knowing how many x-rays machines we should buy?
well, you would, if it were me and I owned the hospital, I would look at that number and go, okay, so we should probably see like if we've had wait times, if we've had people waiting for the x-ray. And I may not be fully understanding the question, that's my fault, but generally I would I would probably just look at the wait times, how many people used it, and then see like, okay, if we have a sizable amount of people waiting for an x-ray, we should probably buy another one so that there's less of a wait, so that it's as efficient as possible and as money making as possible.
It's interesting that you threw as money making as possible in there as one of the criteria, because I'm not sure how you would maybe reconcile that with the other criteria. Let me give you an example. Like, so you have access to how many people are coming in, how like long the wait list is, all these kinds of however much information you want, really. And then another doctor, let's say it's me, for example, looks at the exact same data and says, "So you think we should have 2 X-ray machines, and I think we should have 3 X-ray machines. So what process can we use to figure out which one of us is correct, if it's either of us?"
Um, well, it would just kind of come down to trial and error, or who would be running the hospital, who would obviously have the higher say. If we were like the same position, then there would really be no way to really decide which one's the best without trial and error, or without supporting fact or anything like that.
Okay, I'm going to take a step away from the hypothetical now, not because you're like answering it wrong or anything like that, but just because I don't want to torture the hypothetical horse. The answer to the question that I'm trying to lead us towards here is this thing called economic calculation, which is inextricably connected to profit and loss. So, what everyone should take into consideration at all times, and this is just essential to all decision making, is that an X ray machine is a scarce thing. There's a limited number of X ray machines. And not only is it the X ray machine itself that's scarce, but it's also the materials that the X ray machine is produced from. So, the precious metals or rubber or all these things, the specialization of the people who build it is also a scarce resource. So, if you have an X ray machine in your hospital, let's say you could, sometimes there's an accident that happens. Maybe there's like a crush at a sporting event. It happens once every 5 to 10 years. And when that happens, you get all these people with broken bones at the same time, hundreds maybe. And that causes a big old problem. So your hospital would benefit from having 100 X-ray machines, because you know that this happens. You can use actuarial science or just basic statistical analysis. You can say, all right, well, how we have it ever long, often it causes this much of a problem for us. It'd be nice if we just had enough X-ray machines. We can just process them. The real question I'm asking you is, how do you know that when you say, well, let's take a step back from 100 X-ray machines, you're trying to decide between me and you. Do we need 2 X-ray machines, or do we need 3 X-ray machines? And it's not just about, well, okay, maybe we can make the wait time shorter at our own hospital. How could you know that the hospital that you are taking the X-ray machine from wouldn't have done better with it? They wouldn't have brought about more good for human beings with access to the X-ray. Now, what I'm trying to bring you to here is the conclusion that it's completely and utterly, entirely impossible to even begin trying to figure that problem out. Now, I'm going to give you a historical example. It's kind of unrelated, but it's a fun example, so I'm going to insist. In the Second World War, the Third Reich, the National Socialists, they came up with this scheme because, you see, they were starting to realize that they were getting really low on tires. They were getting low on bullets and other essential things. And they became aware of the fact that if a bullet goes to one rifle company, another rifle company is one bullet less. There's a limited number of bullets, they're scarce. So what they had to do was, they're like, okay, we need to know how much each person needs. So what they literally did, actually, was sent out surveys to every rifleman to say how many bullets he needed. You want to guess how many bullets every rifleman on the front lines thinks he needs? I don't actually know the number, but a lot, obviously. My point is, that's just one example of how this problem is unsolvable. That's just a fun example. My point is, you can't do it. And I'm not condescending to you here. No one can do it. You cannot figure out if this extra X-ray machine is going to be, in the general sense, not just in your hospital, but is it going to do more good where it is or somewhere else? There's only one possible way to do it. There is no other alternative, and that is profit and loss. So the key to economic efficiency, I think this statement sums it up beautifully, is the optimal amount of production is that amount which any additional units will have a higher opportunity cost than the benefit that you get out of that unit. So that's what you're aiming for, that optimum amount. The only way to determine that is through the profits. So, with the case of X-ray machines, as you purchase more X-ray machines, the prices of them goes up because of the relative scarcity of them. And your ability to use those X-ray machines is also going to be affected by this. So, um, I don't want to get into math here because I'm not even that strong in the math, but every X-ray machine that you add is going to add like a different amount of productivity to your hospital. So, you know, the first X-ray machine might be in use all the time. The second X-ray machine might be in use 80% of the time, but there might only be, the third X-ray machine might only get used 10% of the time. And that's I'm oversimplifying it, but I think that captures my point. With profit and loss, you can actually determine, you can figure out if we add a third X-ray machine, we're going to be like where the X-ray machine's coming from because it's no longer profitable for us is actually going to be we're taking it away from a more important use. And it's not just for X-ray machines. It's for all of the things that the X-rays are for. So if you start buying up all the X-ray machines and then all these materials start getting used, maybe those same things are used in computers and vehicles and farming equipment, like what have you. And then the price goes up of those things as well. This is the only way as humans that we're able to actually determine that question. What is the amount of something that if we produce any more than that amount, we're actually paying a higher opportunity cost than we're getting benefit from it? So that's where all these hypotheticals were kind of walking down the yellow brick road to. And why is that so important is, well, it's been a while since we started talking about this. So I'm going to do my best to remember why we started. But the government can't do this because profit and loss is something very specific. It's a way of sort of detecting, let's say, the relative importance of things to different people. It's measured in money. It has to be measured in money. If you Because the reason it has to be measured in money, by the way, is because money can be exchanged for anything. So you can say when you're paying for something, you can actually say like the money that I spent on this could have been spent on any other good in the market. So that's how you know, like what the opportunity cost is. It's part of why it has to be money. The government can't just say, well, we printed $1 trillion and gave it to ourselves. So like because we're willing to pay for this stuff now, that just proves that it's better in our hands or whatever because we're escaping the profit and loss. Prices, as they really are, true prices are the prices that are not affected by government interference. So as soon as the government gets involved, they aren't paying prices for anything anymore. Even if the government walks up to you and points a gun in your face and says, "Sell me that X-ray machine, or I'll kill you," you may actually sell them the X-ray machine and get money in return for it. But this is the fact that they had to threaten you is an indication that it was necessary for that extra coercion. Otherwise, they would just buy it from you. They wouldn't have to threaten you. And the government's role in all of this, it makes it so that it's impossible to do this economic calculation. And because it's impossible, this thing you were saying with the Libertarian Party of America about you don't agree with they have this policy about healthcare. I don't remember what the verbatim was. Is you think the government should be involved in that? But it is necessarily the case that by involving the government in it, you have made it, you have guaranteed that whatever amount of healthcare, because I think that's what you said about their policy, like you think certain drugs need to be enforced by the government that they're available or whatever. You're ensuring that whatever amount of those drugs exists is worse than the proper amount. So it doesn't have to be pills; it can be anything. But that's kind of the point. Your proposal guarantees a worse outcome.
Um, I agree that um the that using profit, using money is probably the best, if not the only way to understand how much of something you need, how much of that thing is optimal, as you said. Um, that being said, when I don't think that advocating for the government to make it a right to do something, that doesn't make anything worse. That just means that the right is guaranteed, in my opinion. And you probably have your own arguments on why it would be worse, on why um things would be more negative because of the government guaranteeing those types of rights. But when when talking about like the X-ray example, right? The government um, mandating hospitals to have to service people, that doesn't really that doesn't really factor into that doesn't really change how they operate. That just changes how they work on their things, how they serve customers, on how they approach customers before they service them. And in the case of guaranteeing the right to access healthcare, that just means that they can't deny people healthcare for any reason. And that doesn't really have to. I get your point on the economic aspect, on how like using profit, using price signals is how you determine whether you're purchasing an optimal amount of the product or the service, or whether you're providing an optimal amount of the product or service. But guaranteeing the right, whether by the state or by a higher body, that doesn't really factor in with that. And I don't see. I could be seeing it wrong, but I don't see how that negatively affects people, businesses, or services to guarantee them the right, especially when most of the people won't have to use that right, because people will, in 9 out of 10 times, generally be able to access healthcare without issue. Besides, the monetary aspect, besides wait times.
Good question. So there's two different ways that I tried to argue for this. The first way was sort of the purely logical by showing that in the market economy, you have every incentive, the strongest incentive, to try to serve as many people as possible and to not uh, revoke their access unless absolutely necessary. And if you decide to do that, if just by some for crazy reason you just decide to start excluding people, in the market economy, that immediately creates an incentive for others to come in and to start providing that service, because the unsupplied demand is a profit incentive. And whether it's one person or a million people, it creates an incentive for somebody to solve that problem. They make themselves better off by attending to this unmet need. That's the logical side. I also showed from more of a empirical side of things. We looked at when we used to solve this problem without government intervention was when we saw the fewest people falling through the cracks. You're not going to get to a 98% coverage of healthcare if hospitals are actually doing this thing where they're excluding people for arbitrary reasons. And you're not going to see. I mentioned before that for me charity is sort of a side point. It's not by any means the main argument that I'm making, but it's worth noting you're not going to see history's greatest amount of medical charity if there's like this tendency to exclude people. So I think based on both the logical side of things and the empirical side of things, it is I would assert that I've established successfully, and we may disagree about this, but that this is just not a problem that's true. Just not something that actually happens. But even if it did happen, um, and there's one or two people who fall through the cracks, so to speak, there's sort of a outstanding contradiction with your position about that still, because earlier you said that you're actually okay with people falling through the cracks in some cases. So I'm not sure how to reconcile that with this sort of concern here. But in any case, there's the logical and the empirical reason why this is not a problem. But let's say that that's still not convincing. What I would say is, well, how is it a problem to just force people to have to not turn anyone away. Well, let's consider for a moment what's actually required to make that a real thing. Obviously, if you have no means of enforcing it, then you're not actually making it a rule. You can't, like I can't be a quadriplegic and be like, you're not allowed in my room or I'll kick you out. You know what I mean? Like, because I can't do anything about it. That's not an actual, maybe you can say, well, some people might just do it to be nice, but that's not how a rule works in society. That's not legislation. That's just people being polite. So, in order to enforce this notion of you're saying the law of association is out, you don't get to choose who you associate with. If somebody wants to buy your services, you have to give them your services. And how do we enforce that? Well, at the bare minimum, we need to steal money from everybody. So we got to have taxes. So right off the bat, that's a enormous loss to all of society in order to solve this problem that I established earlier, or I purportedly established earlier, isn't even a real problem. So now everybody in society is a victim, guaranteed. We've guaranteed that the whole population is victimized in order to ensure that some small amount of people, an indetectably small percentage of people, based on the statistics I shared before, they shouldn't have the risk of being victimized. So all of society has to be victimized in order to make sure that risk never actualizes. Now, it's not enough, of course, to just tax them. You need to use that taxes to fund all kinds of apparatuses. So you need to have some sort of government to make the decisions about how to spend the money. You need to have a police force that's going to need to start spending that money on things like a police cars, training dogs, uniforms, guns, training people, building buildings. Remember, we talked earlier about how all of these things are scarce. So we talked about how the materials that make the X-ray are scarce. We talked about how the X-ray machines themselves are scarce. So now, building materials, human labor, which is going to be captured by the people who become police, the vehicles, the things that vehicles are made out of, computers, firearms, all these things, they are now going to, we can, with economic absolute certainty, we know that they are going to a less important purpose because people were freely not spending their money that way. That is not what you're saying. No, whatever the way you want to spend your money was, that's gone. We're replacing it with something that's way, way, way lower down your list. For most people, if you were to say, well, hey, if you didn't buy that, car, was the very next thing you were going to do with your money to just donate all the money to the police department? I think most people, that's very far down the list from how they actually were spending their money. So we've taxed the whole population. So we have, one, in an ethical sense, victimized everybody in order to avoid the possibility that a small number of people are victimized. Two, we've destroyed some amount of everyone's wealth. I mean, if you live in Canada right now, it's just damn near everything because our taxes are so high that, like, I get a paycheck now, it's almost like a third of it comes off. So you take everyone's taxes, then you use those taxes to do more economic damage. You're saying whatever that brick was going to be used for, maybe it was building a hospital or a post office or whatever. Now it's building a police department. Then, once all the economics and everything is done, you're taking a class of people and you're saying these people are privileged. They can harm you with impunity, and you no longer, everybody in society has just lost that they own themselves. Because if you use yourself in a way that this police force doesn't like, they are going to come and use, and they only have one tool, which is physical force. They can use their words to inform you that the physical force is going to be used against you if you don't comply, but that is a threat of physical force still. So everybody in society has not only been victimized as the victim of theft and economically damaged by this misallocation of resources. Now, the prevailing institution, the idea of this society is nobody owns themselves. The government owns you. And if at any point, if you're a doctor, let's say, or a baker, and you say, I'm not serving this person, they insulted my face, or I just don't like the way they look, it doesn't matter. We're going to assert that you don't own yourself. We're going to come in and we're going to threaten you first. And then it could be imprisonment. It could be a beating. I mean, if you resist, you're going to literally die. Um, it could be that they'll take, I mean, something that really happens is that they'll garnish your wages. You know, they'll take some of your property, a greater amount of your property than they already were. So to package that all up, there is no such thing as we live in a society and we would like to enforce these sort of like cosmic rules. Like you have to be nice, you can't refuse service to anybody, and they just make society better. You have to evaluate what is the actual cost of implementing that rule. And so let me think if I can just summarize this in a sentence and hand it back to you. I showed a logical reason and an empirical reason why the problem of people falling through the cracks is essentially not a real problem at all. And then everything else I just said was showing how the proposed solution to this problem would be extremely harmful. And the only thing I would add to that is people take for granted that those harms are small solely because we're used to it, because that's the state of affairs already that we were born into. But I don't think that that establishes at all that the harms that I'm describing aren't exactly the way that I am asserting that they are. So, yeah, I feel like that's what I want to say about that.
Okay, so the first thing you talked about was how you said something about how I'm fine with people falling through the cracks, and I'm not fine in the sense that it's like an oh well thing. Obviously, it's a bad thing, but at the same time, like I'm saying that you can't prevent everyone from falling through the cracks, as we agree on, because it's inefficient to prevent everyone from falling through the cracks. It's inefficient to enforce policies that go too far to try and achieve that goal. Now, when you were talking about how, like, with taxation and stuff, how in order to enforce the ideals that I want solidified, that you would need obviously a police force, you need a government to direct this police force. When you talk about the taxation, like take Canada for example. Canada does have high taxes now, but if they only had a system where you only have that police force where the taxes are only based on paying for the police force, paying for the people who manage the police force, at least on a federal level, those taxes would be very insignificant for the massive amount of people who live in Canada, because obviously the Canadian government does so much more than that currently. But if they were just doing that, you would be paying very little, and it would be very insignificant. And you are right that it would still be taxation. And I know you view taxation as theft. You view it as a negative thing, and that is understandable. But when you do talk about taxation, it would be a lot more insignificant than now, and it would be very minimal. I couldn't put a specific price tag on how much it would be, but it would be like, I would
Less.
estimate less than a few $100s per person per year, and that's significantly less than what everyone's paying now, basically. Um, Now, you also talked about how the government would essentially own people because of the fact that they would be able to enforce their will on them using this police force. And while I wouldn't necessarily call it owning, that is true that they would be able to enforce their will on them. That is true that they would be able um, to do virtually whatever they wanted, because they would essentially have a monopoly on that, as you talked about. But you also said that they can harm without immunity, and that's not true, because that's not true now, and that wouldn't be true then, because there would be a court system, presumably, and obviously, that would also cost tax money. You would also have to pay to fund that.
No,
But
so just to clarify, what I'm talking about isn't that once you're a cop, you can beat people up randomly. That's not what I meant by with impunity. What I meant is you go in to the baker and you're like, "Bro, you're not serving the black people in the community." And the baker's like, "Yes, that's correct. I'm a racist." And the policeman says, "Okay, well you have to start serving them." And the baker says, "No, I will not do that." And he says, "Okay, well the punishment for that is you're going to jail. And the baker says, I'm not going to jail. And then the cop beats him and takes him to jail. The cop is not going to get in trouble for that, right? We see that on the news like every day, start to finish. So that's what I'm talking about harming people with impunity. I would never imply that the police can just grab people randomly and that's so. I just want to be clear about that.
Well, yes, you're right that the police would have immunity to enforce the law if the person resists. Obviously, if the person doesn't resist, then beating them would be unjustified. But if they're resisting arrest for committing a crime, then presumably, yeah, then force would have to be used to put them in prison. That's how that works now, and that's how that would work if there were a police force that were enforcing a certain set of ideals. Yeah.
Okay, so we're in
But
agreement about that then.
yeah, we're in agreement about that. But what I was talking about generally is how, like you said, with the taxation, it would be a lot smaller than now. It wouldn't. You still view it as theft, and I can't really change that. I'm not trying to change that, but it would be pretty insignificant. You talked about how like right now it's like about a third of your paycheck, and I don't dispute that. But if the only things being funded by the government were a police force, a judiciary to oversee the government, and obviously the people running the government themselves, then the taxes would be really minimal.
Right.
The
But
government.
look, so I want to draw attention to your fact, just because I think this is really super germane to the what you're saying now. In my my long-winded explication that I gave about that, I never actually referred to a specific magnitude of the harm. I simply showed why it would be a harm at all, and that's a different category of claim. So I want you to know that I totally agree that if you had a state that does less, then it would be um, presumably spending less money than we currently have. I totally don't contend that at all. Except with the hospital, you and I agreed that we can use profit and loss to determine how many x rays are good for us, and at the same time, how many x rays us having is good for society. What mechanism can the police department, how does the police department know how big it needs to be? How does the police department know how many of which car it needs for its people? How many cops to hire? What guns to use? How does it know how many police departments it needs per jurisdiction? How does the police department know how much to pay the individual cops? Should it pay them the minimum wage? Should it pay them 10 times that or 100 times that? There's no way to know. It's just literally there is an absolute complete absence of a mechanism to determine how much they should spend. Now, you could say, well, they need to spend the amount of money to stop people from falling through the cracks. But okay, so there's people falling through the cracks, and there's a police department still. So we need to expend more money. We just got to expend their expenses until there's nobody falling through the cracks. How do you differentiate between a police department that has 0 people falling through the cracks and that spends $1 billion a year, and one that has 0 people falling through the cracks and spends $1 million a year? Like, what process would you use? So what I'm saying here is I'm trying to draw your attention to the fact that this is just like the process you're using with the hospital and the x-rays is not something you can even emulate in the police department and government example. You are totally without a way to do that. So I agree with you that on principle, funding a police department only should, you would expect, to be a smaller expense than funding a police department, the FBI, the CIA, the ATF, funding firefighters and funding hospitals and funding, you know what I mean? And maybe, probably, I think that it seems intuitive and welcoming to think that. But again, how could you even start to guess that? Because like we actually agreed earlier, essentially, there is no way to even make an informed decision about this institution you're talking about in the first place. So I can't even really give that to you because I have a concrete example of the hospital needs the amount of x-ray machines that's profitable. There's no negotiation on that, and that maximizes the well-being for society. The institution that we're talking about now, which is this government, which also all the politicians are going to need money, I didn't mention that before. They're going to need buildings too. All of the expenses there. I never mentioned the magnitude of the harm that's being caused. Um, but those harms, there is absolutely no limit or bound or logic for them whatsoever. They're completely unbounded. So I can't in good conscience grant you that we can just assume that it has to be a lower cost, because it's necessarily the case that you're not using a decision making process to come up with how much cost it should have at all. You can't. So it just can't be known. It can't. There's no reason to expect that actually it would be less, um, other than the fact that the fire department being public and healthcare department being public would also have the same inflationary budget problem. So having multiple institutions that are doing that, okay, sure, it would be to have one police department would be cheaper than to have two, but you can't limit that the cost of that one police department isn't going to, like, how do you know that it wouldn't exceed the fire department and police department and hospital of a town over? And certainly the one thing we know for absolute certain is that whatever the cost is, it is harm. We know for a fact that whatever amount it is not that optimal amount of production. It's got to be some other distant number necessarily.
Well, you say there's no real way to know how much something how much a body should spend in order to fulfill the needs and goals that it's trying to do. And you're partially right, I feel, because money is a good way to figure it out, but you don't necessarily need a profit incentive to figure it out. Like, just an extreme example, like, you know that, like, obviously $1 trillion for a police department for a town of 300 people is obviously way too much. That's
Why?
way
Why is that obvious?
because when you're spending goods on things that aren't used, then then
Hold
they're just
on. Why
going
would you?
unused
Why
and
are
they're
we
waste.
assuming? Why are we assuming they aren't being used? First of all, the police. Like, if you're a hospital and you're buying an X-ray machine, you can't just buy $1 billion X-ray machine. You would go out of business. You would be forced to not do that, because you would immediately just be bankrupt. So there is no leeway there. If you're a government and this guy comes in, he's like, "Hey, I got like the best police cars. They're $1 billion each," and the government goes, "Ah, yeah, awesome. Okay, there's no profit or loss. So there's no consequence to that. The only possible consequence would be if the resulting taxes were so high that the people, like the actual entire population, rose up and actually overthrew the government as a result of how high the taxes had gotten. That's the only limiting factor. So to say it's obvious that $1 trillion is too much, well, it's obvious that it is for a hospital. I can prove that it is for a hospital, but you're talking about a different thing altogether, where there's nothing limiting. There's no underlying rationale for its expenses.
With that point, I don't think I can really refute that, because I do kind of see how the government could just declare an arbitrary number for taxes, and there's nothing anyone could do except, vote them out in a few years, or do that rising up. I do agree that, yeah, there wouldn't be anything that could stop the government from doing that. And I do give the government too much benefit of the doubt, I think, to assume that they wouldn't spend too much on something that doesn't need to be spent too much on, because they just can't. There's little anyone can do about that except vote them out or just take them out forcefully.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think I really respect your being candid about that. Um, I think I would just say too, like, as just to bounce back off of you on that, is, if I don't know, like, for me personally, I actually have worked for the government before as like a federal employee, and I know lots of people who do, because the area that I live in is like way over a quarter of the population here are direct government employees. Um, Whenever something goes wrong, and this is a story you'll hear from libertarians all the time, but it's something that you can have firsthand experience with real easy, because they talk about it like this on the news too. every time something goes wrong, the postal service. So in Canada, are you like kind of like, do you visit Canada, or were you from Canada originally? Like, how much experience do you have with Canada?
I've been, but I was little, but I do know a lot about Canadian politics and stuff. I don't know a lot about their postal service, so I don't know too much about that specific example, probably.
Sure, sure. Okay. No, I just wanted to ask because where we met in that Discord, I didn't want to make any assumptions. So like we have a postal service and it's garbage, and no one's allowed to compete with them because they're protected by the government. But every time they have a problem, right? Like if you have a hospital and the hospital dips $1 underneath the profit line, everybody who's on the board of directors is going to be like, okay, we're going to fix this right away. We're going to identify exactly like whatever, and that's what happens. With the postal service, they're doing a terrible job, and they're like making losses, and they're not like, they're losing mail, all these problems. And what is the solution, right? Well, they need more money. So if you're a business, if you're a hospital, and you're like you have terrible doctors, you're getting sued for malpractice, you're damaging equipment from carelessness, like all of these things, you're at a business, right? Other people are going to pick up the slack. They're going to do a better job because that's what they're incentivized to do, and your access to resources is drained on a daily basis as a consequence of your behavior. With what's literally happening, like in Canada, this is why I go into Canadian discords and I like to talk to other Canadians about this stuff. Um, there's this never-ending feedback loop where every single, and this is not just the postal service. Like I invite you to look at any institution or appendage of the state at all. It's the same thing. They will come short. They will need more money. It's an infinite feedback loop, and there is not a limit. The people who are in that institution, they're normally unionized. Their whole purpose is to get more money for themselves. But if you work at a hospital, specifically a private hospital in a competitive environment, or if you're the baker, you want to make more money. The only way to do it is to sell more of what you sell by, well, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. Be better at it, do more of it, whatever, but you make more money. If you work for the government, you don't have that incentive. You do not make more money by doing a better job. You don't do a better, like by satisfying more people's desires. You don't do it by producing more. The government employees get more money by increasing the amount of money that's distributed to them from other people. That's the, just by definition, that's the only way that they can do it. So they are, where I'm proposing a system, or rather I should say a state of affairs, where everyone's incentivized to produce for other people, and sometimes, very rarely, for whatever reason, they're not going to want to. But what's going to end up happening is, for 99.99% of the population, you're going to have um, the alignment between people's actual incentives and like pro-social stuff. But if you put into practice this sort of like a government, then you guarantee that there's a section of society who are necessarily at odds with the rest of society. They need to create, maybe I don't want to phrase it that way. They increase their well-being at the rest of society's expense. So I don't think I'm making like an argument there per se. I'm just riffing off of the most recent thing you said.
Yeah, I do think you're right about that. How, with that postal service example that I understand a little bit more of how they work now. Yeah, that makes sense that private businesses, they're incentivized by doing a better job. The employees are incentivized by doing a better job because the business does a better job. But the government doesn't, they don't make money the better they do. They make money, I guess they would if they were doing like trade and stuff, but if they were doing like another direct way to do it is just through taxes and through taxing more people. That being said, I do have to go now. It's been way longer than I thought it was going to be. Um, but I think at the end of it, I have come to terms more with what ANCAP is, and I do agree with it more than I thought I did before. And I still do believe in the whole in like thing where there should be a guarantee, whether it's from the state or anyone else, that certain things will be guaranteed, that you will have certain rights. But, I do agree a lot with the economic sense, and there are a lot of arguments that I do have to consider. But thank you for this and the opportunity.
Yeah, this was super, super nice chat. I really appreciated it. Thanks so much. I mean, you're totally right. We're way longer than I even expected, so I super appreciate that. It's been my experience that people like we have this conversation. There's going to be like if you're thinking about it and you're interested in it, there's going to be like 100 billion counter arguments that are going to pop into your head now, like after the fact. So like 100%, just feel free if you want to either do this again or just type me a message and ask me like, hey, like doesn't this refute you or whatever? Be happy to go through it.
Yeah, of course.
Sweet. All right. Well, I'm going to end it there. Thanks again so much. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have another good chat sometime not terribly long in the future.
Yeah, thank you.